Okay, in this video we're going to look at biopsychology, which is essentially a very biological component of the exam, and it's looking at how the body can influence behaviour. So physical processes within the body, how the body is structured, how it works, and how that can influence how we act. So there are 4 sections that you need to know about for this unit. We've got the divisions of the nervous system, neurons and synaptic transmission, the endocrine system, and the fight or flight response. And we're going to start at the top with the divisions of the nervous system. So here we have a representation of the nervous system within the human body, and the nervous system is divided into 2 sections. The first section is called the central nervous system, and this is composed of the brain, which obviously processes all the information that we receive from the environment and helps us to make decisions on what we want to do. And the second part of the central nervous system is the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord is a dense set of neurons which extends from the base of the brain and runs all the way down our spine. Now, the spinal cord is responsible for reflex reactions. So situations, for example, if you put your hand on something that's incredibly hot and you immediately take it away because it burns you, that's not a conscious decision. So our brain is aware of that information, but you didn't have to stop and think about whether you wanted to take your hand away. It was a reflex reaction, and that's because the central nervous system took over. So in some situations where action is needed immediately, the brain doesn't make the decision. It's the spinal cord causes the reaction, and then the brain is informed of what has actually happened. So the second part of the nervous system is called the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral just means outside or edge, and the peripheral nervous system is a series of neurons which extend from the central nervous system, so from the brain and spinal cord, and they extend into every part of the body. So they'll go into all your limbs, fingers and toes, and they allow us to receive information from the environment and for that information to travel to the brain, and also for the brain and central nervous system to send signals back to our limbs so we can move our muscles in ways that we choose to move them. So the peripheral nervous system is again divided up into 2. So some of the responses in our body, things like breathing, heartbeat, they are not voluntary. So those will happen whether or not we choose to do them. They're automatic processes, and they are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system is again divided into 2. So we've got the sympathetic branch. So this is a branch that creates arousal within the body, causes action to happen. And we have the parasympathetic branch, which returns the body back to the resting state. Now, the autonomic nervous system and the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches we're going to come back to towards the end of this video when we look at the fight or flight response. The second part of the peripheral nervous system is the somatic nervous system, and this is responsible for movements, actions, responses which we voluntarily control. For example, moving your hand in the air because you choose to, that is part of the somatic nervous system. So if we have a look at the structure of neurons, so the neurons are what make up the nervous system. So it's what the nervous system is composed of. And there are 3 different types of neurons that you need to know about: sensory, relay, and motor neurons. And they are all, their function is very much described in their names. So if we take sensory neurons first of all, these are ones that carry messages from the senses, and they just take those messages to the central nervous system. So they are telling us what's going on in the environment around us. Motor neurons do the opposite. So motor neurons carry messages from the central nervous system to whichever cells or glands or organs are responsible for whatever movement, action or response needs to be given. Now, if you look at the structure of these 2 neurons, in both cases, at one end of these neurons, they are connected to a receptor cell in the case of sensory neurons, or in the case of motor neurons at the bottom, you can see it's connected to that red tube. For example, that might be muscle cells that allow the signal to cause that response within a particular muscle. Now, both sensory and motor neurons are found within the peripheral nervous system because they are carrying messages to or from the outside world, or from muscles, organs, glands to the central nervous system so that information can be processed. Now, relay neurons, which are the ones in the middle, you can see they are not connected to receptor cells or to muscle cells or anything like that. Instead, they do exactly what the name suggests. They relay information. So they carry information from, for example, sensory neurons to motor neurons within the central nervous system. So relay neurons are found within the middle bit, and they are the bit that carries the information from a sensory neuron to a motor neuron, or the opposite way around, from a motor neuron to a sensory neuron. Now, although these neurons have their own unique structures which are related to the function that they carry out, there are some parts of neurons which are common across all the different types that you need to know. And you could be asked to label or draw a diagram in your exam. So if we look a little bit closer at the structure of neurons, you'll see that they all have this very similar structure. So at one end on the left, we've got these sort of pointy, spindly bits called dendrites, and they are the bits that first receive the information from whichever source it's come from. So the electrical signal, information travels along neurons in the form of an electrical signal, or what we would call an action potential, that enters the neuron through these dendrites, and the dendrites are attached to the cell body. The cell body is the part of the neuron that contains the nucleus and enables the cell to remain alive and to keep carrying out its purpose. So that's sort of the hub of the cell. Now, extending from the cell body, you can see a long tube which is called an axon, and encased around this axon is what's called a myelin sheath. Now, a sheath is like a cover, and myelin is the material that it's made from. So the sheath is not complete all the way along. There are little gaps, as you can see, between each of the cells, and these are called the nodes of Ranvier. And these allow the electrical signal, the action potential, to essentially jump from one node to the next node, therefore speeding up transmission. Now, when the electrical signal has passed all the way down the axon, it gets to what's called the axon terminal. And those are the little sort of buttony things that you can see to the far right. Now, neurons don't touch each other. So one neuron, as it's passing information to the next, won't actually touch the next neuron. So the action potential travels down in this direction. When it gets to the axon terminal, it reaches what's called a synapse. And a synapse is a very, very, very tiny gap. And we're going to have a look at that when we look at synaptic transmission next. So if we have a look at, these are two neurons which I've just put together. When you get to the axon terminal of one of the neurons, the first one, so if we think again about this is the direction the action potential is travelling, when it reaches the axon terminals of the first neuron, there's then a gap before it can get to the dendrite of the second neuron. Now, in this diagram, I've made this gap much bigger than it would be in real life. It's microscopic, but we're going to zoom in on this bit and have a look at what's actually happening when the action potential reaches this point. So here it is, we've zoomed in. So we're going to use some possibly quite complicated terminology at this point, but all of this terminology makes sense within the context that it's being used. So if you think about the actual words, you'll find them much easier to remember. So again, we're looking at the axon terminal here of the presynaptic neuron. So the synapse is just the gap in the middle. So presynaptic just means before the synapse. And on the other side, we've got the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron. So again, postsynaptic just means after the synapse. And this is the direction that the action potential is travelling in. Now, when the action potential reaches the terminal of the presynaptic neuron, one thing it can't do is jump across the gap. So there's got to be another way for that signal to get from the axon of one neuron to the dendrite of the other neuron. Now, within the axon terminals, we've got these. They're vesicles, and they store what we term neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals. They are only found within the central nervous system. And when the electrical signal reaches the axon terminal, those neurotransmitters are released. So the electrical signal stimulates the vesicles to release those neurotransmitters into the synapse. Now, through diffusion, the neurotransmitters move across the synaptic gap, And when they reach the other side, they bind with these receptor cells, which are these little black things on the right-hand side. And as they bind, that causes the action potential to be stimulated within the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron, and then the electrical signal can carry on. So when we're thinking about synaptic transition, action potentials themselves are not just excitatory. They don't just cause something to happen. They can be both excitatory or inhibitory. So if we've got an action potential which is excitatory, it's more likely to cause a neuron to fire, and you're more likely to get a response as a result. If you have an action potential which is inhibitory, they're more likely to cause a neuron to not fire. They're more likely to stop a response. Now, whether or not you actually get a response will depend on the summation of these action potentials. So if the excitatory action potential is stronger than that of an inhibitory action potential, then you're more likely to get an action, and vice versa. If the inhibitory action potential is stronger than the excitatory action potential, then you're less likely to get a response. Okay, the endocrine system. So this is another chemical system within the body, but instead of looking at neurotransmitters, which you find within the brain, we're looking at hormones, which are chemical messengers that act on the entire body. So the endocrine system is the hormone system. Now, hormones travel in the bloodstream, so they go everywhere, and they are released from many glands and organs around the body. This diagram here just shows you some of the glands which release hormones. Some of them will be more familiar to you than others. And these hormones are generally responsible for slightly slower changes within the body. For example, puberty is probably one of the most well-known examples. It happens over many years, whereas when you compare it with neurotransmitters, the response to a neurotransmitter being released tends to be a little bit more immediate. So some examples then, the thyroid gland, which you can see is sort of in the neck. That produces thyroxine and is responsible for regulating metabolism within the body. A very important one for you to know is adrenaline. This is released from the adrenal glands, which sit just on the top of the kidneys, and that's very important within the fight and flight response, which we're going to look at next. So the fight or flight response then. Just a reminder, first of all, of how the nervous system works. So I said we were going to come back and have a look at the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system, remember, is split into two different sections. The autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for automatic or uncontrolled responses. And within that, you've got the sympathetic branch, which causes the body to become aroused, and you've got the parasympathetic branch, which returns the body to a resting state. Now, when we are faced with danger, which is what the fight or flight response is a response to, this is something which our body needs to respond to immediately without us having to think through what our action might be, which is why it's controlled by the autonomic nervous system and not the somatic nervous system. So what happens in the fight or flight response? The initial response is in the brain. When we get stressed by something, the hypothalamus is activated. So the hypothalamus is a part of the brain it's a very primitive part of our brain. It's buried deep within the middle of it, and that sends a signal to the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland is part of the endocrine system. It's located at the base of the brain, and it's often called the master gland because it's often responsible for controlling the hormonal release within the rest of the body. Now, when the pituitary gland is stimulated, that sends a signal to the adrenal gland, which were the ones that were sitting on top of our kidneys, and they release adrenaline. Now, adrenaline, you'll be probably quite familiar with the response our body gives to adrenaline. Things like if your friend jumps out at you and you have an increased heart rate, your muscles contract, your breathing gets very shallow, it basically gets you ready to carry out some sort of action. Now, at the same time, the sympathetic nervous system is being activated. Now, remember, this is the branch of the autonomic nervous system which causes arousal within the body, and that helps to cause all of these symptoms that are associated with the fight or flight response. These symptoms include all of the things that you put on here, again, things you'd be familiar with. So as I said, things like your breathing becomes very quick, your heart heartbeat speeds up, your muscles become very tense, and all of this happens in response to the stressor in order to get you ready either to fight whatever it is that's potentially dangerous or to run away. Those are your two responses. Now, once the stressor has passed, we obviously want to return our body back to its resting state, and that's when the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system comes in. So as soon as the stress has passed, that kicks in and we go back to how we were before. Right, now there's an awful lot in this video, so it is well worth you looking at it a few times, going back to the notes in the pre-reading and making sure that you really understand it. So ways that you can test yourself, make sure you can explain how the nervous system is divided up. So there's lots of key terms in there: central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, autonomic and somatic nervous systems. Make sure you know what all of them mean and what all of them do. Secondly, the structure of a neuron and how that helps how it helps it perform its function. Can you draw them without looking at a diagram? Could you label one? Could you explain it? Can you explain the process of synaptic transmission? So including the idea of summation, can you explain how an action potential is transmitted from one neuron to another? Number 4, can you define what the endocrine system is, and can you give examples of hormones that act within the endocrine system? And lastly, can you explain how the nervous system and the endocrine system work together in order to cause the fight or flight response?